Dragons in the Waters by Madeleine 1. The Forklift. The MS Orion was tied up at Savannah, Georgia. Simon Rainier, hands in the pockets of his old-fashioned gray shorts, looked at the small white ship with mounting excitement. He would be spending the next week on the Orion en route to Venezuela, and already standing on the pier in Savannah, he was farther away from home than he had ever been in his 13 years. It was chill this February day, with a thin rain and a biting wind. In a more sheltered part of the dock stood his cousin, Forsyth Fair, with whom he would be traveling, and his great-aunt, Lenoir Fair, with whom he lived, and who had come with them on the train from Charleston to see them off. Simon looked at the two of them standing under the shelter of the shed with their umbrellas, and thought that if he were traveling with Aunt Lenoir instead of Cousin Forsyth, he would be perfectly happy. Aunt Lenoir was comfort and all rightness in a precarious world. Cousin Forsyth he had known for barely a month, and while the distinguished-looking middle-aged man was courteous and pleasant, he was not outgoing, and to Simon he was still a stranger. He looked damp and uncomfortable with the rain dripping off his large black umbrella, and the collar of his dark raincoat turned up. Even the corners of his waxed mustache seemed to droop. The old woman, on the other hand, stood straight as an arrow, unperturbed by the downpour. Can't you come too? Simon begged her. I'm too tired, child, the old woman had said. At 90, I've earned the right to my rocking chair and my books. Besides, I have to stay home and take care of Boz. The old dog, in pointer years, was almost as old as Aunt Leonis. And let's say it's Leonis and not Lenoir. Hopefully we'll stick with that. His proud skeleton showed under the still, glossy, liver-spotted body, and Simon felt a tightening of his stomach muscles as he realized the old hound might not be there when he returned. He turned his face into the rain and moved farther away from Aunt Leonis and Cousin Forsyth, past the gangplank of the Orion and on down the dock. All around him was activity. The tall yellow arms of the Orion, swinging sacks of seed and grain and rice up onto the ship to be stored in the hold. Simon watched in fascination as a large station wagon was carefully hoisted up from the dock, swung loose for a moment high in the air, then was lowered gently onto the foredeck. On the aft deck stood the passengers who had already embarked at Brooklyn or Baltimore, eagerly watching the business of loading the freighter. A few of them waved at him, and he waved shyly back. Then he turned to watch the orange forklifts buzzing rapidly up and down the dock, the two long tines of their forks fitting neatly into the small wooden platforms onto which bags and bales were piled. Great yellow arms swung out from the Orion, dropping heavy ropes which were looped around sacks and platform. The crane raised its burden to the ship's foredeck, and the highly mobile forklift darted away, moving far more easily than an ordinary tractor, turning on a dime to reach for another load. The sailor managing the long-angled pincers from his glassed-in cab high up on the Orion swung the bags and sacks with easy accuracy. Everywhere was bustle, and men shouting, and the smell of wet wood and the salt wind from the sea. Simon would be almost sorry when they boarded, so fascinating was the loading procedure. He jumped as he heard a horn, and a Land Rover drove onto the dock, full of children who kept piling out, like clowns out of a car at the circus. Simon found it difficult to keep count, but it appeared to be a mother and father and 7 children. After considerable shouting and laughing, the 2 older children, a girl and a boy, sorted themselves out, managed to get 2 battered suitcases from the Land Rover, and came to stand not far from Simon. The mother urged the younger children back into the car out of the rain, and the father, rain dripping off his cap, stood leaning in the window, talking to the mother. The girl, banging her old suitcase against her knees, dropped it by the gangplank and came on down the deck toward Simon. Her brother followed, She was, Simon guessed, maybe a year older than he was, maybe 14, and probably would resent being called a child. The boy looked younger, although he was as tall as Simon, who guessed him to be no more than 12. Both brother and sister wore yellow slickers and sou'westers, and were considerably drier than Simon, whose fair hair was slicked wetly to his head. "Hello," the girl said. "Are you going on the Orion?" Her accent was not quite foreign, but it was certainly more precise than the soft southern speech Simon was accustomed to hearing. "Yes'm, and you?" "Yes, at least Charles and Daddy and I are." She smiled, a swift spreading of sunlight over her face. "How nice to have someone our age. Daddy warned us that freighter passengers tend to be ancient. I'm Polly O'Keefe, pronounced Polly, but spelled with one L. I'm 14, and this is my brother Charles. He's 12. So he had been right. "I'm Simon Rainier, and I'm 13. Again, Polly smiled, the shaft of light lifting the drab day. "You're not traveling alone, are you?" He indicated the man and the old woman. Suddenly, Cousin Forsyth stepped forward as one of the forklifts picked up a large wooden crate. He watched anxiously as ropes from the Orion were looped around it. "Be very careful," he fussed. "It's extremely valuable. It contains an irreplaceable portrait." The dock hands nodded indifferently as they went about their business. The forklift backed away from the crate, which was then lifted up in the air and hung swinging between the ship and the dock. "What's in there?" Polly asked Simon. "Your father looks as though he's about to have a heart attack." The horn of the Land Rover tooted before Simon could answer or correct her. "We have to say goodbye," Polly cried. "We'll be back in a minute, Simon." And she and Charles ran across the dock, dodging loading trucks and forklifts. Simon watched rather wistfully. Well, there was a tangle of hugging and kissing goodbye. Then he looked up at the Orion in time to see the great crate with the portrait being safely lowered onto the deck, and Cousin Forsyth mopping his forehead with his handkerchief as though it were hot. Aunt Leonis was still standing in the shelter of the shed, and her small, not very waterproof umbrella. Simon ran over to her, skidding on the wet boards. Where's Cousin Forsyth going?" "He's off to make sure the portrait isn't going to get banged or crushed. I certainly can't complain about his care of it. He's overzealous, if anything." She put her gnarled old hand on his head. "You're soaking, Simon." "Yes, ma'am." "You'll be boarding in a minute or two. You're old enough to take care of yourself without me, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "And don't let Forsyth overprotect you. He can keep that for the portrait. I want you to have some fun." He leaned lightly against her. "I'll miss you. It's time you got out of the nest, child. A nonagenarian is hardly a fit companion for a boy. I'm glad there are other young persons on board." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm going now, Simon. I have a train to catch." She was still taller than he was. She bent down and he kissed her softly on the cheek. For a brief moment, she held him to her. Then she stood upright and gave him a little shove. "Run along now." Tears filled his eyes. He did not want her to see. Moving in a blur of tears and rain, he crossed the dock. He paused at the gangplank, but the tears would not be held back. Polly and Charles had said their goodbyes and were hurrying along the dock toward him. No one must see him cry. He moved on past the gangplank, past the stern of the Orion, on to the very end of the dark, slippery dock. He did not see the forklift, out of control, hurtling towards him. Someone on deck screamed. He felt a shove, and both he and Polly O'Keefe were in the water. The forklift ground to a screeching halt, barely avoiding crashing off the dock after them. The water was icy cold. Their clothes dragged them down. From the deck of the Orion, round orange life preservers were thrown into the water for them. Both Simon and Polly had managed to grab onto the pilings of the dock and were clinging to them safely. Dock hands pulled them up from the chilling water, and they stood dank and dripping in the February rain. The driver of the forklift kept explaining that his accelerator had stuck. The shivering boy and girl were surrounded by the entire O'Keefe family, by sailors and dock hands. Aunt Leonis used her umbrella to get through the mob to Simon. Through chattering teeth, he said, I'm all right, Aunt Leonis. Please don't miss your train. The old woman turned her sharp eyes on Polly. I saw. You saved him. If you hadn't thrown yourself at him and got him out of the path of the forklift, he'd be... She looked at the vicious prongs of the forklift and did not finish her sentence. She turned to the father of the family. You will watch out for him, sir? I am gravely concerned. Dr. O'Keefe replied, Of course I'll keep an eye out for him, but I don't think you need worry. It was only an unfortunate accident. Aunt Leonis looked at him sharply, but all she said was, Where is Forsyth? If he's going to worry about the portrait to the exclusion of the boy... The captain of the ship came running down the gangplank, followed by a youngish man with officer's bars on his dark sleeve. I am Captain Van Leyden, and this is my first officer, Mynheer Boone. Mynheer Boone smiled and draped heavy blankets over Polly and Simon. Van Leyden said, Boone will get the children aboard and help them, or a hot tea too, please, Boone. Simon held out his hand. Goodbye, Aunt Leonis. His voice faltered slightly. He hoped this would be attributed to the cold. Aunt Leonis shook his hand formally. Then she said to Dr. O'Keefe, I do not think I am being just a foolish old woman. To Polly, she said, I'm much obliged to you, Miss Polly O'Keefe. It wasn't anything. Aunt Leonis said, It was. To Simon's surprise, Charles O'Keefe looked directly at the old woman and replied, Yes, it was. Miss Leonis's eyes were clouded with more than age as she watched Simon, his dripping blanket-covered form, trudge damply up the gangplank. Polly O'Keefe and her brother and father were ahead of Simon. Forsyth Fair, who had emerged from the ship just in time for farewells, was behind, fussing over Simon in much the same nervous way he had fussed over the portrait. It was apparent that the boy was being taken care of. The nice Dutch officer would see to it that he got hot tea and changed to dry clothes. There was nothing more she could do. She walked slowly along the dark, wet boards of the dock. Mrs. O'Keefe was trying to herd her excited younger children into the Land Rover. She saw the old woman struggling along, wind tugging at her ancient umbrella. Is there anywhere I can drop you? A Land Rover is not the most comfortable vehicle in the world, but at least you'll be out of the rain. Miss Leonis looked at the younger woman and the children, who had stopped their chattering and were staring. Thank you. I should be much obliged if you'd take me to the railroad station. I think I may not have missed my train. Sandy, Denny's, help Mrs. She paused. Fair, Miss Leonis Fair. I can manage quite nicely myself, thank you just the same, young gentleman. With the help of her now furled umbrella, she pulled herself briskly onto the high seat of the Land Rover. Mrs. O'Keefe asked, Can we drive you any farther than the station? Thank you, no, I'm taking the train to Charleston. Mrs. O'Keefe turned around in the car and looked back at her children, then smiled at the old woman. What with all the excitement on the dock, I think it very likely you've missed your train, and I've been promising the children a visit to Charleston for ages. We'd be delighted to drive you there. Now that my husband has gone off for a month with Polly and Charles, surely everybody else deserves a special treat. There was a loud noise of agreement. Miss Leonis looked at Mrs. O'Keefe, who was now smiling serenely. I'm much obliged to you. You are very kind. Not at all. It's you who've given us the opportunity for sightseeing, and the weather report promised sun late this afternoon. And the rain's beginning to slacken off already. Do you live right in Charleston? Out in the backwoods. The old woman's next words seemed to be audible thinking rather than conversation. I hope I have made the right decision. It's not normal for a young boy to live all alone with an old woman. Then she pulled herself together and spoke briskly. I would be delighted to give you a conducted tour of Charleston, and then perhaps you will drop me off on your way home. Do you live north of Savannah? Yes, Benecide Island. Leonis Fair turned around and stared solemnly at the children. I hope you young ones have stamina. You may find me difficult to keep up with. There was stifled giggling as she asked Mrs. O'Keefe, "Your husband will keep an eye on Simon?" Mrs. O'Keefe turned the car away from the dock area and onto the highway. "Of course he will. He's used to having a mob of children to keep track of. It will make me easier in my mind. Simon has never been away from home before, and that was not a proprietor's beginning." Mrs. O'Keefe said lightly, "If he and Polly needed an introduction, that was surefire. They're probably the best of friends by now." Miss Leonis was silent for the next mile. Her gnarled hands held the umbrella handle, and she tapped the steel tip thoughtfully on the floorboards. Then she spoke quietly. "Your daughter saved Simon's life. I shall not forget that." On the MS Orion, Simon and Polly in their separate cabins were changing out of their soaking clothes. Simon alone in the double cabin he was to share with Cousin Forsyth. Forsyth wondered if Dr. O'Keefe or Charles was helping Polly. Forsyth Farr had said, take a good hot shower, Simon, and wash your hair. That water by the dock in which you chose to swim can hardly have been very clean." Simon did not reply that the swim had not been of his own choosing. "And dress in warm clothes. I don't want you coming down with a cold right at the beginning of the trip. I am very susceptible to colds." "Yes, sir." "I must go tend to the portrait now. One of the boards on the crate came loose as it was being loaded. Captain Van Leyden says that since cabin 5 on the port side of the ship is unoccupied until Caracas, the portrait can be stored there. I certainly wouldn't trust it with the rest of the cargo," and off he fussed. Simon stood for a long time under the hot shower, not so much to wash off the oily waters as for comfort. The noise of loading and unloading continued outside its portholes. The ship was still safely berthed in Savannah, but he felt very far from home. What had seemed like a great adventure only a few hours ago now gave him a cold feeling in the pit of his stomach and an ache around his heart. He wanted Aunt Leonis. Not that Cousin Forsyth wasn't kind, but Simon found it odd that it was the middle-aged bachelor who had suggested that the boy accompany him on this voyage. He got out of the shower, dried, and put on his seersucker bathrobe. Cousin Forsyth had said, "There's no point in packing winter things. After the first or second day of sea, it's going to be summer." Simon shivered. His soaking blazer was the warmest thing he had. "Come in," he called to a tap on the door. It opened to a young man, barely out of boyhood, with dark hair and eyes, who was wearing a white coat. He bore a small tray with a pot of steaming tea and some buttered rusks with Gouda cheese. Simon smiled his thanks and asked the young man's name. "Geraldo Enrique Armando Jose Ramirez. I am the assistant steward at your service. You are Simon Renier?" "Simon Bolivar Quentin Farranier. We have the same number of names. I pronounced Simon the English way instead of the Spanish way." Geraldo poured tea for Simon, put in a lemon and sugar. But you are named after the great general?" "Yes," Simon said and shivered. Geraldo looked at the boy in his inadequate cotton robe. "You have nothing warmer?" Simon pawed through his suitcase and pulled out a lightweight, sleeveless pullover. Geraldo shook his head. "That is not enough, and it will be tomorrow before I have your wet things cleaned and pressed." He sounded like an old man. "Drink your tea, please, while it is hot. I will return." The steaming lemony tea warmed Simon inside and out. He sipped and unpacked and ate rusks and cheese, and unpacked some more, taking care to leave most of the drawer and wardrobe space for Cousin Forsyth. He knew that Cousin Forsyth would have preferred a single cabin, but when they had booked passage, the 2 single cabins on the Orion were already taken, one by Polly. There was, however, plenty of room for 2. The bunks were divided by a sizable chest of drawers, and Simon took the bottom drawer. Cousin Forsyth had already put his briefcase on the bunk on the inner wall, so Simon had the bunk under the 2 portholes. This would have been the bunk of his choosing, and he would not have felt free to take it if Cousin Forsyth had not established himself on the other. The boy knelt on the bunk and peered through the glass. Cabin 3 was on the dock side of the ship. Sacks of grain were still being loaded deep in the hold. Sailors and dock hands shouted back and forth. Forklifts skittered about like bugs, beetles with long, sharp mandibles. He was not feeling very happy about forklifts, and he turned away. He took his small stack of paperback books out of the bottom of his suitcase and arranged them in a rack where they would be easy to reach from his bunk. Then he put out his face cloth, toothbrush, and toothpaste. Over the 2 wash basins was a fan. For which there was no present need. In the radiator, the steam was clanking. By the side of each wash basin was a thermos flask and a holder. Simon uncorked his and peered in. Ice water. He corked it again, sat down in one of the 2 small chairs, and poured himself another cup of tea. Then he heard a loud, deep honking. The ship seemed to shake from the vibration, and he realized that the Orion was indeed throbbing. The engines were being revved up. They were about to sail. He knelt on his bunk again and looked out. On the deck, the longshoremen were unhooking the great ropes which held the Orion to the pier. 2 dark-uniformed sailors pulled the gangplank aboard. 2 others leapt across the dark gap of water between dock and lower deck. Slowly, the dock seemed to recede from the ship. The dark expanse of water dividing ship and land grew wider and wider. Seagulls swooped about, calling in raucous, excited voices. Deep within himself, Simon felt an echoing response of excitement. He was at sea, on his way to Venezuela. He began to whistle, softly, a minor haunting melody, and then to sing, I met her in Venezuela, a basket on her head. He was still looking out and singing softly when Geraldo returned with a heavy navy blue sweater and a fisherman's cap. Mynheer Boone is lending you the sweater till it is warmer. The cap is for you to keep. You will need it to keep the sun off your nose as well as the rain off your head. He knelt on the bunk beside Simon, not much larger than the younger boy, and they looked at the activity on the dock, becoming small and almost unreal as Savannah drifted farther and farther away. In schoolboy Spanish, Simon tried to thank Geraldo and was interrupted by a bang on the door and Polly's voice. Here we are, Simon! And she burst in, wearing a long plaid bathrobe, which undoubtedly belonged to her father. Her short, carroty hair stuck out in spikes from being rubbed dry. Charles, in jeans and a red turtleneck, followed her. All right if we come in? He asked. Oh, please do come in, Simon welcomed them, indicating Geraldo. Do you know? Oh, yes, Geraldo brought us hot tea, too. Like Herald Angel. That's what Geraldo sounds like. I used to spell it with an H instead of a G. Then she burst into a stream of Spanish so fluent that Simon found it difficult to follow. Geraldo spoke slowly and carefully to Simon. You understand that Geraldo begins with a G, which is pronounced like an H in Spanish? And the other passengers are all having tea in the salon. Mr. Farr would like you to please join them as soon as you're dressed. At Geraldo's grave courtesy, Polly flushed, the red beginning at her neck and moving up her face and forehead. I'm sorry, Simon, I didn't think. Under his breath, Charles said, Don't show off. Polly flung around as though to flash a reply to her brothers and stopped herself. It's okay, Simon assured her. Really, it's okay. And just as I was feeling smug about my Spanish, too, teaches me how non-existent it really is. We used to live in Portugal, Polly explained. On Gaia, an island off the south coast. If you learn Portuguese, which is a stinker, it's easy to learn Spanish, whereas it's most difficult for someone who speaks only Spanish to learn Portuguese. And, she broke off. Am I showing off again? Charles sat down on Cousin Forsyth's bunk. It's second nature, he said, not unkindly. Then bestowed a singularly sweet smile on his sister. On Simon and Geraldo, a slow blooming of pleasure, quite different from Polly's flash of light. Did you see us sail? Our cabins are starboard, so we almost missed it. What with you and Polly having been so suddenly in the soup. Simon glanced at the porthole through which he had watched the land, rather than the ship, move slowly away. It was exciting. I've never been away from home before. Even coming to Savannah was a journey for me. Where's home? Polly asked. Near Charleston. Charleston, South Carolina? Simon's surprised look said clearly as the words, Is there any other? Then he indicated the sweater and cap. From Geraldo, he's lending me Mynheer Boone's sweater, and he's given me the cap. Polly spoke to Geraldo in Spanish, but this time it was slowly and carefully so that Simon would understand. Geraldo, would you tell them, please, that Simon and I'll dress and be right along, and it's a lovely cap. I will tell them, Miss Polly. Then he referred to a slip of paper he pulled out of his pocket. On the passenger list it says Polyhymnia. Polly, please, Geraldo. Charles grinned. Polyhymnia is a muse, the muse of sacred music. Polly pulled the belts to her father's bathrobe tight in a determined gesture. If any of you calls me anything but Polly, there'll be murder. Not at the beginning of the trip, Charles said. Geraldo picked up Simon's tea tray. I will tell them. What? Charles said. That there'll be murder? That you will shortly be in for tea. Okay, Polly followed Geraldo out, but turned at the door. I won't be more than 5 minutes. Hurry, Simon. Charles asked, Shall I stay and talk? Please do. Please do, Simon said. Simon took clean undergarments, navy blue shorts, and a blue cotton shirt from his drawer, and went into the shower to dress. Charles reclined on Cousin Forsyth's bunk. If you had all the brothers and sisters Polly and I have, you wouldn't have room for modesty, but you're an only, aren't you? Simon compromised by leaving the bathroom door half open. Yes. How come you and your father are taking this trip? Not my father. Simon pulled on his shirt and emerged. I didn't think he seemed terribly fatherly, at least not like our father. I get the feeling he's not used to children. I don't think he is. Simon sat down on the edge of his bunk and pulled on the navy blue socks. And pulled on the navy blue knee socks. Charles, his hands behind his head, looked up at the ceiling of the cabin. How do you happen to be traveling with them, then? Simon pulled the heavy sweater over his head. The rough wool felt comforting. He pulled Geraldo's cap over his still damp hair. His shoes were with his other wet things, so he took a pair of worn sneakers from the bottom of the wardrobe. Cousin Forsyth offered me the trip, and Aunt Leonis thought it would be good experience for me. Since I'm a country bumpkin, I guess you've done a lot of traveling. Oh, some, but mostly we've lived on Gaia, this island. The younger kids were born there. Last year, we came back to America and moved to Benecide Island. But most of us still think of Portugal as home. Polly appeared in the doorway, now dressed in a plaid skirt and a burnished orange sweater, which just managed not to conflict with her hair. Daddy's a marine biologist, so islands are very good for his work. Come on, let's go brave the lion's den. Charles rose from Cousin Forsyth's bunk, and Simon smoothed the coverlet almost as anxiously as Cousin Forsyth had supervised the loading of the crated portrait. Polly helped him. What would he do if he found Charles had sat on his bunk? Beat you or something? Oh no, he's very kind. It's okay, Charles glanced impatiently at the bunk. You'd never know anybody'd ever sat on it. Let's go, we're expected to meet somebody. In the salon, Geraldo was replacing one teapot with a fresh one. Polly led the way in. Charles slipped past her and sat on a sofa beside his father. Simon held back at the doorway, shyly looking at the people sitting on sofas and chairs around the tea table. Cousin Forsyth did not greet him. He seemed concentrated fully on the woman pouring tea, a dark, handsome woman, very Spanish-looking, though she turned out to have the incongruous name of Dr. Wordsworth. She and her traveling companion, Dr. Eisenstein, were professors on sabbatical leave from their university. Dr. Wordsworth taught Spanish, so she must be at least half Spanish, Simon thought. Cousin Forsyth said, It was indeed a pleasant surprise for me to find the lovely Inez Wordsworth on the Orion. We knew each other many years ago when we were both young in Caracas. Dr. Wordsworth replied with distinct chilliness, It was not that many years ago, and our acquaintance was slight, very slight. Cousin Forsyth raised his fine eyebrows but made no comment, and Dr. Wordsworth went on to explain to the children that Dr. Eisenstein was an anthropologist going to Lago de los Dragones in Venezuela to make what Dr. Wordsworth called an in-depth study of the Quiztano Indians, who lived at the far end of the lake. Polly said with interest, "We're getting off at Puerto de los Dragones too, and going onto the lake. Daddy's been asked to." She caught a warning look from her father and hurried on. "I think it's lovely having a town and a lake be places of dragons. I'm very interested in dragons. Of course, one always thinks of St. George and the dragon, and he's my favorite. But did you know that Margaret of Antioch had a dragon too?" As always, when she came close to blundering, she talked too much about something else. "Forklifts look a little like dragons, don't you think?" After a slight pause among the company, Cousin Forsyth said dryly, "I hadn't noticed the resemblance." "Maybe they don't spout fire," Polly said stubbornly, "but they can be as dangerous as dragons, right, Simon?" Simon nodded and continued to observe the passengers and listen to the conversation. He learned that afternoon tea was not usually served on the Orion. This tea party was an impromptu affair. Some of the passengers, seeing Geraldo brewing tea for Simon and Polly, had suggested that tea in the salon would be a pleasant and informal way for new and old passengers to meet. Dr. Wordsworth did not offer tea to the children, but began to refill the adult passengers' cups. Simon looked at her hands, which had long scarlet nails. They were not young hands, and the flashing rings and bright nail polish accented rather than minimized their age. Aunt Leonis did not wear nail polish, and though her nails were horny with age, Simon compared Dr. Wordsworth's hands unfavorably with the old woman's. Dr. Eisenstein appeared more to Simon a brown mouse of a woman, brown all over, suit, eyes, and shadows below the eyes. There was considerable brown remaining in her graying hair, which she wore braided in a thin crown on top of her head. Her smile was friendly, Simon thought, and did not exclude the children. He turned his regard to the three other passengers, 2 old men and 1 old woman, all 3 probably considerably younger than Aunt Leonis, but nevertheless old. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were both plump and beaming. They were from New Hampshire and were en route to visit their granddaughter and great-grandchildren in Costa Rica, and were obviously thrilled at the prospect. Mrs. Smith was knitting a blue baby's booty, and with her pink cheeks and curly white hair, she looked like a magazine illustration of the perfect grandmother. The last passenger bore the formidable name of Emmanuel Theotokopoulos, and Simon was relieved when they were told to call him Mr. Theo. If Dr. Eisenstein looked like a friendly field mouse, Mr. Theo was small and frail as a sparrow, but he emanated enormous vitality, and he had lively dark eyes and a mop of yellowed white hair, which stood out in a thick ruff around his head. He looked, Simon decided, not in the least like a bird, but rather like an aging lion. Cousin Forsyth's words caught his attention. "A portrait of Simon Bolivar, which I am taking to Caracas as a gift to the Venezuelan government." Simon's shyness was overcome by Cousin Forsyth's proprietary air about the painting. "The portrait has been in our family always. It is the greatest portrait ever painted of the general, and I am named after him. Simon Bolivar Quentin Farr Rainier. The portrait was given to my ancestor, Quentin Farr, by Bolivar himself, and it belongs to my Aunt Leonis." He stopped short. Cousin Forsyth had bought the portrait from Aunt Leonis, the portrait which otherwise would one day have belonged to Simon. It was no longer Aunt Leonis's. It would never be Simon's. The grown-ups had started playing the "Since It's a Small World, Don't You Know" game. Cousin Forsyth and Dr. Wordsworth had once known each other, so it was likely there might be more connections between the passengers. Mr. Theo asked Dr. O'Keefe, "I suppose this is a very long shot, but one of my oldest friends was in Portugal a couple of years ago and got involved with a marine biologist there. Could you be the one Do you know Tom Tallis? Polly precipitated herself into the conversation. He's my godfather. He's one of our very favorite people in the world. Simon felt excluded from the excitement shared by the O'Keefes and the old Greek. Who was this man who was so important to them that Polly should be dancing with joy? Dr. O'Keefe said, I don't know what we'd have done without Tom. For a priest, he does get himself involved in some extraordinarily sticky situations. Polly turned to Simon, drawing him in. He knows everybody in Interpol and Scotland Yard and everything. He's not really a detective, but whenever there's big trouble, he gets called in to help. Dr. O'Keefe said wryly, let's hope there's no cause on this voyage to send for him. For once in his life, he's living quietly as a canon of St. Paul's and being allowed to be a priest. Mr. Theo nodded. It would be splendid to have him along just for fun, but I've had my share of excitement, enough to last me for a long time. My doctor was very firm that this is to be a quiet voyage for me. My heart would take much more wild adventuring. Dr. Wordsworth came into the conversation. That's exactly what freighter travel is for. Peace and quiet. Ruth and I are exhausted. We slept the clock round last night and feel much the better for it. During the normal academic year, I have precious little time for myself. The tea party was breaking up. Mr. Smith tucked the Wall Street Journal under his arm, remarking that they would not see another newspaper until they reached Port of Dragons, and there would probably be only Spanish papers there. It was not a port which attracted many tourists. Mrs. Smith held up a blue booty to hide a yawn. I think I'll have just a wee rest before dinner. We were so distressed by the accident. Coming, Odell? Mr. Smith helped her up. I could do with some shut-eye, too. You youngsters may have had the dunking, but it was quite something for us oldsters, too. What a mercy that no real harm was done. Patty, I'll see you later. Folks, arm in arm, walking with legs slightly apart so they could balance themselves against the slight roll of the ship, Mr. and Mrs. Smith moved like storks out of the salon and into the first cabin on the starboard passage. Forsyth Farr looked at Simon. Have you unpacked? Pretty much, sir. Polly jumped up. I haven't. Charles, have you? Sort of. I was waiting to see which drawers Daddy wanted. Come on then, Charles, Dr. O'Keefe said, and we'll get things sorted out. Simon, again feeling somewhat lost, watched them leave. Dr. Eisenstein rose. I think I'll check my notes on the Quistano Indians until time for drinks. We usually meet in here for drinks before dinner, Mr. Farr, and of course, as soon as it's warm enough, we'll sit on deck with our preprandial libation. That would be the day after tomorrow, Dr. Wordsworth announced in her definitive way. You are quite sure of that? Forsyth Farr smiled. Quite. Dr. Eisenstein started coming out and turned toward the portside passage. Coming, Inez? Shortly, Ruth. Mr. Theo retired to the farthest corner of the salon with a book. Simon went close enough so that he could see what it was, a complete Shakespeare with print so small that he wondered that the old man could read it. But he had put on steel-rimmed spectacles and was smiling at what he was reading, totally engrossed. Simon did not know what he was supposed to do. Cousin Forsyth was looking through some papers on one of the tables. Dr. Wordsworth was gathering books and embroidery into a needlepoint bag. He felt very young and inexperienced, standing comfortably in the middle of the salon. When Cousin Forsyth continued to read, Simon wandered across the room, bumping clumsily into a chair as the ship rolled and returned to the cabin. It did not seem courteous to Cousin Forsyth to close the door, so he left it open and pulled flowered curtains across the opening. These, he assumed, were for use when the weather was hot and every available breeze was sought. Now he let a draft in which would have been unpleasant had he not been uncomfortably warm in Mynheer Boone's sweater. He knelt on his bunk, his cheek to the porthole glass, and gazed out. The rain had stopped, but the light was beginning to fade. Land was a dim purple shadow on the horizon. The ocean was dark and mysterious and speckled with white bursts of spume. The sound of water was all around him. The small ship creaked as it pressed through the waves. From somewhere below decks, Simon could hear orders being shouted in guttural Dutch. voice. There was male laughter, solid and reassuring. Outside the open cabin door he heard voices. He had been aware of them for some time without focusing on them. Have nothing to hide. That was Cousin Forsyth, speaking in a warm and intimate way Simon had not heard before. Oh, do we not? Simon recognized Dr. Wordsworth's strong, slightly harsh voice. Are you still dwelling on that, my dear? I had almost forgotten. No, I was not referring to that, but I was thinking that the fact that a young man should have fallen in love with a beautiful young girl is nothing that need be hidden. I'm charmed that our cabins are adjoining. And I am not. Dr. Wordsworth's voice did not soften. I waited because I wished to speak to you. Simon cleared his throat, but evidently not loud enough to call attention to his presence. Because Cousin Forsyth continued, Lovely. I wish to speak to you too, and I do not wish that. What I want to say to you is that I will not let you bring up the past. It is dead and buried, and I want it to stay that way. Are you ashamed to claim acquaintance with me? Acquaintance FP, she emphasized. Acquaintance FP, she emphasized the initials. Nothing more. And I would not speak of shame if I were you. Simon felt acutely uncomfortable. Dr. Wordsworth's voice shook with emotion. I prayed that we might never meet again. I left Caracas and made a new life in a new world. I should never have come with Ruth. Come, Inez. It's not so extraordinary that our paths should cross again. Can't this be an opportunity for a new understanding between us? She had difficulty keeping her voice low. After what happened, I haven't forgotten. How can I help you? Can't I help you forget? Can't I help you to forget? Can't you, after all this time? I had forgotten until I saw you. I will not allow you to presume on the past. Dr. Wordsworth said with icy control. We had made acquaintances, no more. Farrah's voice was tolerant. How intense you still are, Inez. That has not changed. I hope that before the voyage is over, you may be willing to forget. Meanwhile, of course, I defer to your wishes, though I fail to understand. I gave up expecting you to understand anything a long time ago. The past is past. I'll kill you if you rake it up. Have I made this clear? Simon heard the door to the next cabin open. Inez, called Dr. Eisenstein. I thought I heard your voice. Have you seen my green notebook? Dr. Wordsworth sighed. Dear Ruth, you are always misplacing things. I'll go look in the salon. Simon, too, sighed and looked out to sea. At the horizon, the light was soft and rosy, pulsing into green above, and then deepening to a blue almost as dark as the sea. It occurred to him that if he went down to the deck below and walked around or climbed over various pieces of cargo, he could get to the very prow of the ship and pretend to be his ancestor, Quentin Fair, who was indirectly the cause of Simon's being on the Orion now, sailing to Venezuela with the portrait of Bolivar. He huddled into Mynheer Boone's heavy sweater and took courage. Quentin Fair may have been 19, a grown-up, a man when he left England to go to Venezuela to fight with Bolivar, but Simon had the same adventurous blood in his veins, he hoped. If Aunt Leonis had been with him, 13 would have seemed a great deal older than it did when he was with Cousin Forsyth. The tall radiators were too hot to touch. It seemed improbable that in just a few days the sun would be warm, and they might even need to turn on the cabin fan. Hello, Simon, it was Cousin Forsyth. What have you been up to? Simon got down from the bunk and stood politely before his cousin. Looking at the ocean, sir. All settled in? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. If you don't mind, I think I'll go out on deck. He could not explain to Cousin Forsyth. He would not have needed to explain to Aunt Leonis that he was going to take a journey into the past and pretend to be his own ancestor, Quentin Fair, setting out from England to the wild and glamorous new world of South America. Quentin was Simon's hero and model, and it was far more splendid to make believe that he was Quentin Farr, the white knight in shining armor, than Simon Bolivar, than Simon Bolivar, Quentin Farr Rainier, who was only a 13-year-old boy. Be careful, Cousin Forsyth warned, "and be sure that you're in time for dinner. Ship's meals are served promptly." "Yes, sir, I'll be on time." He left the cabin and walked along the passage. He heard the cabin door shut behind him with a firm click. It was difficult suddenly to accept Cousin Forsyth as a man with the complete fabric of a past. Until a few minutes ago, Cousin Forsyth had been for Simon only a month old. Before a month ago, Simon had never heard of this tall, grave, suave man with whom he was traveling. It seemed unlikely that this close-mouthed, middle-aged person had once been young and in love. He started down the steps, remembering that only a few hours ago, Mynheer Boone had hustled him, blanketed and dripping, across the foredeck with a high sill over which he had tripped, past the crew's quarters and up these same steps, which Mynheer Boone had told him were properly called a ladder, though they looked like an ordinary staircase. From the crew's quarters came sound and smell, both delightful. Someone was playing a guitar, someone else was rendering the melody on a flute or recorder. Through a partly open curtain, he saw two young sailors lounging on a double-decker bunk. A delicious scent of baking wafted toward him as he passed the galley, and he could see the chef, a young man with round spectacles and a high white hat, taking a tray of steaming pastry out of the oven. The loveliness of the music and the comfortableness of the cooking cheered him. He remembered to step high over the sill and went out on deck into the clean raw wind. Most of the doorways on the Orion had sills far higher than those in a house, but the sill on the foredeck was even higher than the others to keep out the waves in rough weather. The boy stood on the gently rolling deck, breathing salt air, listening to the music coming sweetly from within the ship, punctuated by the sound of men's voices. He picked his way through the cargo, pausing in the clear evening light to look at the writing on the wooden crates. If it was Dutch, he had trouble even in guessing. If it was Spanish, he could usually decipher it. There was a lot of equipment for oil wells and refineries. He guessed that most of the bags of grain and seed he had seen being loaded were now stashed away down in the hold. He moved through the narrow walkways left open between cargo, past a station wagon, 2 cars, and a large black hearse. He did not like the idea of having the hearse aboard. It was 5 years since the death of his parents, and he loved Aunt Leonis and was happy with her. Nevertheless, the sleek, dark hearse was a reminder of death, of grief, of the terrifying precariousness of all life. As he hurried past it, he saw a rayed-out shattering in the windshield that looked as though it had been made by a bullet. Simon shivered, only partly from the blustery wind, and hurried on until he came to the prow of the ship. By standing on one of the bales, he could look out to sea. The cold wind blew through the heavy sweater. He pulled the cap down over his eyes and crouched so that he was protected from the wind. If he tried hard enough, he could visualize the Orion's great yellow masts holding billowing sails, which slapped in the wind, as Quentin Farr must have heard them. But he couldn't. Usually he was able to move deep into a daydream, the intense daydream world of an only child, so real that he heard nothing of what was actually going on around him. But the fact that the Bolivar portrait no longer belonged to Aunt Leonis, that it would never belong to Simon, that it had been bought by Cousin Forsyth, made it difficult for him to plunge deep into his favorite daydream of being the brave and heroic Quentin. He felt lonely and lost. Polly and Charles were safe with their father. They had forgotten him. He closed his eyes tightly, forbidding tears, and withdrew inside himself, not onto a sailing vessel en route for England, to Venezuela, but back to the known world of South Carolina and Aunt Leonis, back in time to the difficult decision to sell the portrait. And we will pause there.